Hello, my name is Simon Locknane. Welcome to this new video from Finance Re. Today we're going to revisit a topic that I published a video on recently, which is around cost allocation. So in the previous video we used Power BI to allocate some head office expenses, and we used a sales driver to allocate those expenses down to more detailed levels of grain so that users could review profitability by different dimensions in their data model. We're going to do something similar today, but rather than using sales as a driver, we're going to use the store area to allocate our expenses. Now, store area is on the dimension table in our model, so that introduces a few complexities. As we did in the previous video, we'll write the measure together, so we'll go through it in detail. And so I think that's enough talking from me. Why don't we go over to my laptop and get started. So here we are in Power BI Desktop, and I'm using Microsoft's Contoso database for this example, the same as we did in part one. So you can see we've got a very simple data model. We've got our central fact table for sales with all of our sales transactions, and then we've got four dimension tables: product date, customer and store. I actually have another table over here which I'll bring in to the view, and this is our central head office expenses that we want to allocate so that we can review profitability at different levels. I'll just show you what that looks like. So it's just imported from Excel. So we've got just for 2019 for different countries. Here are some central overheads. So they're already at the country level, but we want to allocate them down to a more detailed level. In part one, I did also have, just to go back to the part one table, also had some that weren't yet at the country level, head office costs, which we also allocated. I've removed those just to simplify it a little bit for this video, because the DAX will be a little bit more complicated. So yeah, all the expenses are already at the country level. Okay, also so in the first video we left this as a completely disconnected table, and we used in the DAX formulas we created virtual relationships. Again, to make things a little bit simpler, I'm going to create the relationships, physical relationships in this example. So let's do that now. So we've got country. Now, so that's many to one. Now, obviously that's only because we've only got 1 year, but I'm going to make this a many-to-many relationship, because if there's more than 1 year, we'd expect it to be many-to-many. And this is important. So our direction, we want the dimension table to be filtering the expense table. So that's the direction. Yeah, and we now got a many-to-many relationship, which we try to avoid. But in this case, I'm happy because we're just using it to take this these expense numbers from this table, so that's fine. Same on the year. So this will be a many-to-many. Again, we definitely don't want a bi-directional filter, so we want a single filter, and the date filters our head office expenses table. So this will simplify our DAX a little bit for this example. To see how to do the disconnected table, then you can refer to the first video. Okay, so let's go to our report view, and let's add a matrix to our report and bring in the country on the rows. And then let's write a measure to total our expenses on the expense table. New measure. Some doesn't seem to be working. IntelliSense working. Expenses. let's bring that into our matrix. And we can see that now, and these are the right numbers for each country, adding up to 21 million. Let's just format that measure further. Okay, great. And I've got a filter on the page for the year as 2019 because we've only got expenses for 2019. Right, so that's good. But our issue is, so at country level, we get the right expense number. But if we add store name to our matrix, and if we want to drill down and look at individual stores and get a number for each store, obviously then we don't have a number. These stores are all Australia, so it's just returning the Australia number. So we need to allocate this 1 million across all of these stores. We're going to do that based on the store area. So if we look at our data model, look at the store table, we can see that we've got square meters of each store. So for expenses, for stores, maybe area seems like a sensible driver. In the previous video, we used sales to allocate everything. Now, we'll see as we do this by using area, which is on our dimension table. It is a little bit more complicated, but we'll work through it together. We can also see that for each store, we've got an open date and a close date. So we need to think how we're going to cope with that. So different options. We'll see, do we want to allocate expenses to a store that's open at any point in the year, or maybe just stores that are open at the year end? There's different possibilities, or allocate expenses month by month, depending if the store is open. That would be a sort of business discussion about what the correct logic should be. For this example, we'll do so any store that's open at the end of the year, so at the end of 2019, will have a share of expenses. If a store has been closed during the year, so it's by December 2019 it's closed, then we won't allocate any expenses to it. But again, that would be a discussion with the business to decide how we wanted to do that. Okay, so we want to write our new DAX measure, and to help us, we're going to use DAX Studio, an external tool which really helps to sort of visualize different stages of our DAX expression. So open it from this menu. Because I've opened it from Power BI Desktop, you can see it's already connected to our model. Here's our tables. Let's make this a bit larger. Okay, so let's start to construct our measure. So we need to start with evaluate in DAX Studio. We'll do a variable. Now, our expenses in our Excel table are at the country and year level. So I know we're going to have to do some calculations at that level. So I need to take those values from the date table and the store table. So I'm going to summarise from the central facts table. So we'll call this summarise sales. And summarise, that should be equals, summarise sales, date, year, and store country. Let's just see what that brings back. So that looks good. So we've got in our sales table, we've got sales transactions for 2 years, 2018 and 2019. You can see we're getting each country appearing on 2 rows, which is what we would expect. Now we need to start adding the extra columns that we need to do our allocation. So let's put another variable. Add required columns and choose add columns. I'm going to add to the table we just did in the first variable. Now we need to think about what we need. So we're obviously going to need the head office expenses. Head office expense. And yeah, we could write, so we want the sum of head office expenses, head office expenses. Now, this will be wrong, but I want to just show you what we get back there. Let's run that. So you can see it's bringing back for every row of this table the whole total of the head office expenses. So that's adds up to 21 million. And the reason for that is because I've just written this sum, there's no context transition happening, so there's no filter context being applied to these numbers. Hence, we're just pulling in the total. We're summing all the rows of that head office expenses table without applying a filter context based on the rows of this table. So obviously here we want it to be for 2018 Australia, which would be nil, and then 2019 Australia, whatever the number is there. So this is easily fixed. If I wrap this expression in a calculate, then that forces Power BI to calculate the number in the filter context of this table. So if I run this, as you can see, we now get the correct numbers. Now an alternative actually would be to write, because we wrote a measure for the sum of our head office expenses, if I put that in and run that, you can see that I still get the same value. So when there is a measure, there's an implicit calculate within a measure that is included when Power BI does the calculation. So there's no need to wrap a measure in the calculate function. So I just wanted to show you that so that you're aware. Contact transition is quite a big topic. It's one of the more difficult things to grasp in Power BI. So just be aware when you're writing your measures and using virtual tables, you need to make sure that you're getting the right number for each row using the filter context. Okay, so that's a good start. And now we're going to use store area as our allocation. So let's add another column here. So I need to do it here. Let's just space these out. Selected store area, and here, so we want the sum of the store area for the stores that are in the filter context. So I'm going to calculate sum store square meters. Yeah. So. Now, remember, so we decided that we were only going to allocate to stores that were open at the end of the financial year, which is December 31st. So let's just have a look. If I go back to Power BI. look at so we've got an open date. So we want to make sure that the store is open in the year that we are doing the allocation for. And then we've got, if a store has been closed, then it has a closed date. And you can see, for example, this one, so the store name, New Brunswick, actually that's got 3 rows. So some stores were closed but restructured, and then they appear as a new row. I think that's fine. We just ignore the ones that have the close date. Okay, let's go back to our DAX expression. So, so we want to calculate the area. So the store open date must be greater or equal than, so it's going to be date function, and we want has to be greater than or equal to the start of the year. So we get the year from our date table, date year, and that'll be, so it's year, month, day. So open on the 1st of January. Actually, yeah, it's less than or equal to. The store date needs to be before the start of the year, yeah. And we want the close date, store close date to be blank, or if it's closed after the year end, so or store close date is greater than, again, date, year that we're looking at, and this will be 12/31. If I calculate, okay, let's see if I've got that right. So run. Okay, yeah, so we've got different numbers, which is good. So if we look at Australia, 9595. So let's go back to, let's make this a bit bigger. Country, Australia. So we've got 2 closed stores which we'd want to ignore. So the remaining row 69595, yeah. So that's giving us the right number. So that seems to be working how we want, which is great. So that's the area of the selected stores in the fields context. Now, to do the allocation, we want to divide the area of a store in the fields context by the area of all the stores in that country. So we also need another column, area, all country stores. And this will be very similar. So we can use most of the same calculation, but we'll need to add something to our calculate here to remove any filter on the stores apart from the country, because obviously we're doing it, we've got the number by, we've got the expenses at the country level, so we want the stores at the country level, but we don't want a filter here for any more filters on the store other than the country. So we can use all except store country, and that will mean if there's any more filters on the store table, they'll be ignored in this calculation. and we'll still get the number for all the stores in the country. Let's run that again. Oh, I've made a mistake somewhere. All except, so I need to say store, I think. There we are. And we'll get the same numbers because obviously here there's no filter context of store. So this will be all the stores anyway, so we'd expect to get the same number. But when this measure is actually being applied, the selected store area will be smaller, and then we can then calculate a ratio. So that's great. So that gives us the bones of our measure that we need. Let's go back to Power BI. Let's do a new measure on the expenses table. And let's take what we wrote in Tax Studio. Actually, let's say so this will be one. So we've got our two variables, and then we want to return, so that second table just remind you, so I'll open Tax Studio again. Not sure why that's gone so small. We want to iterate over this table, dividing the store area by the area for all the stores in the country and multiply by the expenses. So we're going to iterate sum x over the add required columns table, and we're going to return the head office expenses multiplied by the ratio selected store area and the area of all the stores. And that should be it. Let's just format that. And then let's add this new measure to our matrix. Oh. Yeah, this looks good. So we can see now with the new measure, when we go down to the individual stores, we get an allocation of that million over all of the stores. That looks about the right number. That looks like 1 million. So we can see a store, Northern Territory, which doesn't have any expenses allocated to it. So I'd expect this to be the closed store. So let's flip over to our store table. Yeah, and we can see Northern Territory has been closed. This other one that was closed, South Australia, was restructured actually, so that one was open, so that did get expenses. So that is working as expected. So that's great. And if you remember from the first table, when we used sales as our allocation driver, we could then slice and dice our tables and our matrices by any dimension. So we could bring in the dates, bring in the products, and we still got a sensible allocation of our numbers. And that's because we were using sales, which was on our fact table. So that always gave a good ratio, a proper calculation, so we could review our profitability at any level. Now that's not the case here, because obviously if we brought in another field, say we wanted to also look at product. So if we bring in products category into our matrix, again, if we expand out this first column, so again, obviously when it comes to, so we've allocated the expenses by store area, which is fine, but if we wanted to look at even more detailed levels of grain and look at profitability, obviously there's no way, Power BI doesn't know how to split these expenses down to any other dimension apart from the stores. So what could we do here? One option, and we'll do this together, is that we could use sales as a secondary driver. So when we go down to the store level, we want to use the store area to allocate our costs. But if you go to any other dimensions, then we want to use sales as a secondary driver to allocate the costs. So maybe we can improve our measure so that we can also look at profitability on other dimensions, including the date. So let's go back to DAX Studio and see if we can improve our measure. So here we are back in DAX Studio, and we can build on what we did for the previous measure. Now, because we're going to allocate, we want to allocate first on store area and then on sales, we're going to have to do our calculation. Our virtual table will have to be at the more detailed level. We're going to have to go down to store. So here we're able to just look at year and country, but now I need to include store name in our initial table. So let's run that. So you can see now I have year, country, name, and then we've still got the same columns we had before. So the head office expenses, so 2018 won't have any head office expenses, the area for the selected store, which is now for the specific store, because again this is being calculated in this context, and then the area of all the country stores. Now we need to work out the proportion that we want to allocate the ratio of sales, so we'll need to add in some more columns to our table. So we've got sales. I've got to measure, this will just be our sales amount in US dollars. And that'll be the sales in the filter context. So let's just run that. Okay, so that's the sales in the filter context. And that, to get our ratio, we want to divide that by the sales at the cost grain. So we need to add another column. So just in the same way we're dividing the selected store area by the area of all the stores, we need to divide the sales, the specific sales in the filter context by the sales at the right grain, the total sales. So let's add another column. We'll call it sales at cost grain, and so we need to calculate just our sales amount US dollars again, but we want to make sure that this isn't being filtered by other filters that are being applied. Now, again, I'm going to use some expanded tables. So I'm going to go, because I want to, there's a number of filters that I want to make sure aren't being applied. Again, I'm going to use all except, as I did previously. But I'm going to go from the sales table, and I can then refer to the expanded table. So store country, store name, and the date, the year, because our expenses obviously at the year level. So let's see what that looks like. Oops. Syntax VR. Okay, sometimes just need to add. Okay, there we are. So this is the sales at this grain, and obviously again we're getting, because this is the sales also at this grain, we get the same numbers, which is what we'd expect. But if this was being applied in the measure, if this was being filtered by a product, then this sales number would be lower. This one would be the same, because of, we've said don't filter this down any further. So that would then give us our ratio. So that looks good. So let's again write a new measure in our report. I'll call this allocated head office expenses 2. And let's take what we wrote in DAX Studio. And then we want to return. Again, we need to iterate over the table with our extra columns added. So I'm going to use variables again to keep this easier. So we had the store area ratio, and that was dividing the selected store area by the area of all the country stores. So that just stays the same as it was before. Then we need to have our ratio for the sales. This will be divide sales by sales cost grain. And then we want to return, so it's the head office expenses times the store area ratio and the sales ratio. Let's bring this new measure into our matrix. And let's just format that. Great, so this is looking good. So we can see that we get the same number at the store level, which is what we want. So let's just go back to stores. So yeah, we get the same results. So this million when we're at the store level is being allocated on the store area, and the sales ratio would be being calculated, but it would be the same. So it would equal 1. So yeah, so that's what we want. We're just using the store area at this level. But then if we drill down, so let's drill down to products, we can see that that 62,000 is then being spread on the products. But this allocation is based on the sales numbers. So what are the sales numbers for Australian Capital Territory in total, and what are the sales numbers for these products, and then using that as the ratio to spread that 62,000 even further down different dimensions. And that'll work because sales is on the fact table. That will work with any dimensions, dates, etc. that were being brought into the matrix. So we can still review our profitability at different levels, but having the initial allocation being done on the store. So that was a lot of DAX we've been through. Just to sort of recap what we did. So we had our head office expenses at a country level, and we wrote a measure that would allocate that using the area of the stores, so that we could allocate the cost down to a store level. And then we put a secondary driver using sales, so that users could also split or analyse the costs down to any other dimension that they were using to filter the data, so product or date. Now, because we're allocating using two different drivers at different grains, I think it is helpful to be able to indicate to the user how the allocation is happening. So there's a number of different techniques we could use to do that. I've used one, and if we go back to my computer, I'll show you how that works. So just to finish off, here's our final report, and in the matrix I've just put in our gross profit, then our allocated expenses using the measure that we wrote together. One minus the other then gives us our net profit. One thing to point out is, because you see for online there's no allocated expenses. Online did have a chunk of expenses, but because we're allocating by the store area, obviously online has those stores, so those expenses don't come through. So if we were building this report, we'd have to think of a way of treating the online expenses. Now, what I wanted to show is, because we're doing an allocation differently, depending on the grain that we're looking at the numbers, it's helpful to be able to the end user to see that. So what I've done, I've built a new measure, head office expenses allocations applied. Now this is very similar to the measure that we actually built to do the allocation. So I'm not going to go through this on this video because it's already quite long, but I will upload this file to GitHub so that you can look at it yourselves. And I've then used this measure in a tooltip. So you see here we are looking at the country level. If I hover over one of the numbers, let me just zoom in, you can see this tooltip then appears, just summarising, summarising the sales amount, the cost of sales, the head office expenses, etc. And then underneath I've said head office expense allocation to explain how the allocation of head office expenses is being done. Now, so at the country level, we didn't actually have to do an allocation. That's the level that the expenses are held at in the data. So it just says no allocation of head office expenses required. But if we were to expand down to the store level and then hover over, let me just do it so it's more over this side and zoom in. So you can see now that the description has changed. So it's explaining that the head office expenses are now allocated on the store area. And then again, if we drill down to the products, I can zoom in and it explains now that the expenses are being allocated on both store area and sales. So that's just one way to help users understand the numbers. You could even include sort of a little summary of the allocation formula and the proportions. All sorts of different ways to do it. Or a drill through page where you drill through to get the allocation details. That would be a nice option. So lots of ways to inform the end user about the numbers that they're looking at. So that concludes today's video. I hope that was interesting. I appreciate there was quite a lot of dense DAX formulas that we went through today. I will upload the video to GitHub and put the link on the video so that you can go through it at your own pace. And do let me know if you have any questions. Anyway, that's all for today. So until next time, thank you very much.